I'm Maya, 26 years old, and 3 months ago I collapsed at my marketing firm during what should have been a routine Tuesday morning. What I thought was exhaustion turned out to be a life-threatening condition that required emergency surgery. The hospital called my emergency contacts, my parents, who never showed up. Instead, my older sister Jessica posted Instagram stories from a spa weekend, tagging herself at luxury treatments while I fought for my life alone. That moment of abandonment opened my eyes to 26 years of emotional neglect disguised as tough love, and the revenge I got was sweeter than any family reunion could ever be. Before we dive into this insane story of family priorities gone wrong, I need to know, what would you do if your family abandoned you during a medical emergency? Would you forgive them or make them pay? Drop your thoughts in the comments and smash that like button because this story is about to show you exactly how karma works when you least expect it. And trust me, you'll want to subscribe for this one because the way everything unravels is absolutely incredible. Growing up as the youngest in the Chin family meant living in a world of impossible expectations wrapped in the guise of building character. My parents, David and Linda Chen, were successful professionals who believed that love should be earned through achievement and that emotional support was a sign of weakness that would make their children soft in the real world. From the outside, we looked like the perfect Asian American success story. Dad was a renowned cardiac surgeon, Mom was a corporate lawyer, and Jessica was following in their footsteps as a medical resident specializing in dermatology. They lived in a beautiful house in the suburbs, drove luxury cars, and attended charity galas where they were praised for their contributions to the community. But inside our house, affection was rationed like wartime supplies, doled out only when we achieved something worthy of their approval. Jessica, being 4 years older and naturally gifted in the sciences, quickly learned how to navigate this system. She excelled in school, got into prestigious universities, and chose a medical career that made our parents beam with pride at dinner parties. I, on the other hand, struggled to find my place in their vision of success. While I was intelligent and capable, my strengths lay in creative fields that my parents viewed as impractical and financially unstable. I loved writing, graphic design, and marketing, fields that made my parents exchange disappointed glances whenever I mentioned them. The emotional distance in our family was justified through cultural narratives about preparing children for the real world and not coddling kids into weakness. Physical affection was rare, emotional support was practically non-existent, and praise was so scarce that I learned to treasure even the smallest acknowledgement of my existence. Jessica adapted to this environment by becoming hyper-competitive and emotionally detached. She learned that the way to secure our parents' attention was to excel academically and professionally while maintaining perfect emotional control. She rarely showed vulnerability, never asked for help, and treated every family interaction like a performance designed to demonstrate her worthiness. I took a different path, one that was constantly criticized and corrected. I was labeled as too emotional when I cried after disappointments, too sensitive when I reacted to harsh criticism, and too needy when I sought comfort or reassurance. My attempts to connect with my family emotionally were met with lectures about growing up and learning independence. The comparison game was constant and brutal. Every achievement of mine was measured against Jessica's superior accomplishments. When I made honor roll, it was noted that Jessica had been valedictorian. When I got into a good college, it was mentioned that Jessica's school was more prestigious. When I found success in my marketing career, it was dismissed as less important than Jessica's medical training. What made the situation particularly painful was that Jessica actively participated in maintaining this dynamic. She never defended me when our parents were being particularly harsh, never acknowledged that their expectations might be unreasonable, and often added her own criticisms to reinforce their narrative that I needed to try harder and be more like her. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance. I'd sit through dinners where my parents would brag about Jessica's latest achievements while my accomplishments were either ignored or mentioned as afterthoughts. Extended family members learned to expect updates about Jessica's medical career while my professional success was treated as background information. The financial aspect was equally telling. Jessica's education was fully funded, her medical school tuition was covered, and she received generous support for living expenses throughout her training. When I needed help with college costs, I was told that taking on some debt would build character and teach me the value of money. When Jessica needed a car for her residency, our parents bought her a luxury vehicle. When I needed reliable transportation for my job, I was advised to shop smart and find something affordable on my own. The emotional neglect was so normalized in our family that I didn't even recognize it as abnormal until I started forming close friendships in college. Watching how other families interacted, with genuine affection, emotional support, and unconditional love, made me realize that what I'd experienced wasn't tough love or high standards. It was emotional abandonment dressed up as parenting philosophy. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of our family dynamic was the way it taught me to minimize my own needs and feelings. I learned that asking for emotional support was selfish, that expressing pain was weakness, and that my value as a person was entirely dependent on external achievements that could never quite measure up to my family's impossible standards. By the time I reached adulthood, I had internalized so much of this messaging that I rarely reached out to my family for anything. I'd learned that their love was conditional, their support was grudging, and their attention was reserved for Jessica's more impressive life. I built my own support network, created my own definition of success, and tried to convince myself that their emotional distance didn't hurt as much as it actually did. Despite the emotional desert of my family relationships, I managed to build a life I was genuinely proud of. After graduating with a degree in marketing and communications, I landed a job at a mid-sized advertising agency where my creativity and work ethic were actually valued and recognized. My colleagues became the supportive community my family had never been. Sarah, my closest work friend, was the first person to point out how rarely I mentioned my family in casual conversation. "It's weird," she said one day over lunch, "you talk about everything else in your life, but it's like your family doesn't exist." She was right. I'd unconsciously learned to compartmentalize my family relationships, treating them like distant acquaintances rather than close relatives. I'd attend obligatory holiday gatherings and family events, but I never shared details about my work successes, my personal struggles, or my day-to-day life with them. And they never asked. The emotional distance had become so normal that I didn't realize how unusual it was until I started dating Marcus, a guy from my yoga class who came from a warm, demonstrative family. The first time I met his parents, I was shocked by how genuinely interested they were in my thoughts, my career, and my experiences. They asked follow-up questions, remembered details from previous conversations, and treated me like a person worth knowing rather than a problem to be fixed. "Your family is so different from mine," I told Marcus after that first dinner with his parents. "Different how?" he asked. I struggled to articulate it. "They actually seem to like each other. And they seem to like me, even though they just met me." Marcus looked confused. "Of course they like you. You're smart, funny, and kind. Why wouldn't they like you?" I realized I couldn't explain the concept of conditional love to someone who had grown up with the unconditional variety. In Marcus's world, family members supported each other simply because they were family. Love wasn't something you earned through achievements or lost through mistakes, it was a given, a foundation you could count on no matter what. Professionally, I was thriving. I'd been promoted twice in 3 years, had led several successful campaigns, and was being considered for a senior position that would make me one of the youngest department heads in the company's history. My work was creative, challenging, and financially rewarding, everything my parents had told me creative careers could never be. But when I shared this news with my family during our monthly phone calls, the response was predictably lukewarm. Mom's reaction was, "That's nice, dear. Jessica just got selected for a prestigious fellowship program." Dad's comment was, "Marketing, right? Well, as long as you're happy." The contrast between how my chosen family, friends, colleagues, Marcus, celebrated my successes and how my biological family received them was stark and painful. My work friends threw me a surprise party when I got the promotion. Marcus took me out for an expensive dinner and told everyone we encountered about how proud he was of my achievement. My parents mentioned it briefly to relatives as an afterthought before launching into detailed descriptions of Jessica's latest accomplishments. I started to notice patterns in how differently Jessica and I were treated, not just by our parents but by extended family members who had learned to follow their lead. At family gatherings, relatives would seek Jessica out for conversations about her medical career, asking detailed questions about her specialization and expressing admiration for her dedication. Meanwhile, I'd be asked polite, surface-level questions about my work that clearly demonstrated a lack of interest in the details. The financial disparity continued as well. Jessica's student loans had been paid off by our parents, while I was still making monthly payments on mine. She lived in a beautiful apartment that was partially subsidized by family money, while I was saving carefully for a down payment on my own place. When she needed a vacation to decompress from residency stress, our parents funded a European trip. When I mentioned feeling burned out from work and needing a break, I was told that everyone gets tired sometimes and that I should learn to manage stress better. But perhaps the most telling difference was in how our relationships were viewed by the family. Jessica's dating life was treated with interest and investment. Our parents wanted to meet her boyfriends, asked about her relationship prospects, and made comments about settling down and starting a family. My relationship with Marcus, despite being serious and stable for over a year, was treated as peripheral information. They'd met him briefly at a family gathering and had shown polite but distant interest in our relationship. I began to understand that in my family's hierarchy, I would always be secondary. Jessica's career, relationships, and life choices were treated as family priorities, while mine were treated as personal concerns that didn't require much attention or investment from them. This realization was both liberating and heartbreaking, liberating because it freed me from constantly seeking their approval, heartbreaking because it confirmed that their love truly was conditional and limited. The most painful part was recognizing that Jessica not only accepted this dynamic but actively reinforced it. She never questioned why our parents treated us so differently, never acknowledged the disparity in support and attention, and seemed to view my lesser status as natural and deserved. In her mind, she had earned their favor through her superior choices and achievements, while I had somehow failed to meet the standards required for equal treatment. Despite all of this, I kept hoping that someday my family would see me for who I actually was, a successful, independent, caring person who had built a meaningful life despite their lack of support. I fantasized about moments when they would recognize my worth, acknowledge their mistakes, and welcome me into the kind of loving family relationship I'd always craved. That fantasy would be shattered completely on the day I collapsed at work, when I learned exactly where I ranked in their priorities and how little my well-being actually mattered to them. Looking back, there were signs that something was seriously wrong with my health, but I'd learned from my family to push through discomfort, ignore my body's signals, and never complain about feeling unwell. The Chin family philosophy was that acknowledging physical or emotional pain was a sign of weakness, and seeking help was an admission of failure. For about 6 weeks before the collapse, I'd been experiencing what I dismissed as stress-related symptoms. I was working on a major campaign for a luxury hotel chain, pulling long hours and managing multiple deadlines simultaneously. The fatigue I was feeling seemed proportional to my workload, and the occasional dizziness I attributed to skipping meals and drinking too much coffee. Marcus had noticed changes in my behavior and appearance before I did. "You look pale," he'd comment during our dinner dates. "Are you feeling okay?" I'd brush off his concerns with the same dismissive attitude I'd learned from my parents. "I'm fine," I'd say. "Just busy with work. You know how it is during campaign season." But Marcus persisted in his worry, demonstrating the kind of caring attention I'd never experienced from my family. He'd bring me healthy lunches at work, insist that I take breaks during our weekend time together, and gently suggest that I might be pushing myself too hard. "When was the last time you took a sick day?" he asked one evening when I was struggling to stay awake during a movie we were watching. I couldn't remember. In my family, taking sick days was viewed as a character flaw unless you were literally hospitalized. I'd gone to school with fevers, worked through migraines, and ignored minor injuries because that's what was expected. The idea of staying home from work because I felt a little tired or slightly dizzy seemed ridiculous and self-indulgent. My work colleagues had noticed changes too. Sarah mentioned that I seemed distracted during meetings and asked if everything was okay at home. My supervisor, Janet, commented that my usually sharp attention to detail seemed to be slipping and suggested I take some time off if I needed it. But I'd internalized my family's messages so thoroughly that I interpreted their concern as criticism of my work performance rather than caring attention to my well-being. Instead of recognizing that multiple people who cared about me were worried, I doubled down on proving that I was fine, that I could handle anything, that I didn't need special treatment or accommodation. The irony is that I was desperately craving the kind of care and attention Marcus and my friends were offering, but I'd been trained to reject it as weakness. My family had taught me that needing help was a moral failing, that admitting vulnerability was shameful, and that the highest virtue was stoic self-reliance regardless of circumstances. The physical symptoms were escalating in ways I now recognize as dangerous warning signs. My heart would race during simple activities like climbing stairs or carrying groceries. I'd get dizzy when standing up too quickly, and sometimes my vision would blur for several seconds at a time. I was sleeping poorly despite being exhausted, and I'd developed a persistent low-grade headache that I attributed to eye strain from staring at computer screens. Most concerning, though I didn't recognize it at the time, were the episodes of confusion and disorientation I was experiencing. I'd forget important details about projects I was working on, lose track of conversations mid-sentence, and find myself staring blankly at my computer screen unable to remember what I'd been doing. Marcus witnessed one of these episodes during a dinner at his parents' house. I'd been in the middle of telling a story about a challenging client when I suddenly stopped talking and looked around the table with complete confusion, as if I didn't recognize where I was or who I was with. "Maya?" Marcus said gently. "Are you okay?" I blinked several times and the moment passed, but Marcus's parents exchanged worried glances. His mother, a retired nurse, pulled him aside later and suggested that I should see a doctor as soon as possible. "Those aren't normal stress symptoms," she told him quietly. "She could have a serious medical condition that needs immediate attention." But when Marcus relayed this conversation to me, I reacted with the defensive anger I'd learned from my family. How dare his mother presume to diagnose me based on one brief moment of fatigue? I was fine, I was just working hard, I didn't need medical attention or special concern from anyone. Looking back, I can see that I was literally dying, and my family's conditioning had taught me to ignore every signal my body was sending about the severity of my condition. The message I'd internalized was so strong, that seeking help was weakness, that admitting problems was failure, that needing support was shameful, that I was willing to risk my life rather than acknowledge that something was seriously wrong. The day of the collapse started like any other workday, despite the fact that I'd woken up feeling more exhausted than usual and had nearly fainted in the shower. I told myself it was just another busy day, drank an extra cup of coffee, and headed to the office determined to power through whatever was happening to my body. During our morning team meeting, I had trouble following the conversation and found myself staring blankly at my colleagues as they discussed project timelines and client feedback. Sarah later told me that she'd been on the verge of asking if I needed to step out of the room because I looked so pale and disoriented. But I pushed through the meeting, returned to my desk, and tried to focus on the presentation I was supposed to deliver that afternoon. I remember feeling increasingly disconnected from my surroundings, as if I were watching my life happen to someone else from a great distance. The last thing I remember clearly was standing up to get a glass of water and feeling the room tilt sideways in a way that didn't make physical sense. Then everything went dark, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in an ambulance with paramedics asking me questions I couldn't quite comprehend. The emergency room at St. Catherine's Hospital was a blur of bright lights, urgent voices, and medical equipment that beeped and hummed around me. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, I could hear doctors discussing my condition in terms that sounded both clinical and alarming. "Blood pressure is critically low," someone said. "We need to get her stabilized and run a full cardiac workup immediately." Through the haze of medications and confusion, I managed to give the intake nurse my emergency contact information. My parents' names and phone numbers, the same numbers I'd been required to memorize as a child for safety purposes. The numbers I'd never actually had to use in a real emergency before. "We'll contact your family right away," the nurse assured me as they wheeled me toward the cardiac unit. "Try to stay calm. You're going to be okay." I believed her about my family coming. Despite years of emotional distance and conditional love, despite all the ways they'd shown me I was secondary in their priorities, I still believed that in a real crisis, in a life-threatening emergency, they would come. They were doctors themselves, they understood the seriousness of medical emergencies. Surely this would be different from all the other times they'd minimized my needs. The doctors determined that I had developed severe anemia due to internal bleeding that had gone undetected for weeks. My hemoglobin levels were so low that I was at risk of organ failure, and I needed immediate blood transfusions followed by emergency surgery to locate and repair the source of the bleeding. "You're very lucky your colleagues called 911 when they did," Dr. Patterson, the attending physician, told me as they prepared me for surgery. "If you'd waited much longer to seek treatment, this could have been fatal." As they administered pre-surgical medications, I kept asking nurses if my family had arrived yet. "They're probably stuck in traffic," I mumbled through the anesthesia. "My dad's a cardiac surgeon, so he'll know what questions to ask. My mom will want to talk to whoever's in charge." The surgical team exchanged glances that I was too medicated to interpret correctly at the time. Later, I would understand that those looks contained pity and concern about more than just my medical condition. I woke up 12 hours later in the intensive care unit, groggy but stable. The surgery had been successful, they'd found and repaired a bleeding ulcer that had been slowly draining my blood supply for weeks. The doctor explained that I'd need several days of monitoring and additional transfusions, but that I was expected to make a full recovery. "Where are my parents?" was the first coherent question I managed to ask. The nurse, a kind woman named Beverly who had clearly dealt with difficult family situations before, sat down beside my bed with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "we've been calling your emergency contacts since yesterday. We've left multiple messages explaining the situation and the hospital location, but no one has come to see you yet. I need to pause here because this is where the story gets absolutely unbelievable. You're probably thinking there must be some explanation, some emergency that prevented my parents from coming to the hospital when their daughter was literally dying. Maybe they were out of town, maybe they never got the messages, maybe there was some misunderstanding. Well, stick around because what actually happened is so much worse than anything you could imagine, and the way I found out about it will blow your mind." The words didn't make sense at first. Of course they were coming. They had to be coming. There must be some mistake, some communication error, some reasonable explanation for why they hadn't arrived yet. "Maybe they're stuck at the hospital where they work," I suggested weakly. "My dad is a cardiac surgeon, and sometimes emergency surgeries can take hours. They probably just can't get away right now." Beverly's expression grew even more compassionate, which somehow made me feel worse rather than better. "Honey, we've been calling for over 24 hours. We've explained the severity of your condition and the surgery you needed. One of our social workers even tried calling your sister when your parents didn't respond." "My sister?" "Jessica would come. She was a doctor, she'd understand the medical implications better than anyone. She'd drop everything and drive straight to the hospital. She'd probably bring our parents with her and explain why there had been a delay in their response." "Did you reach my sister?" I asked hopefully. Beverly hesitated before answering. She answered the phone and said she'd try to make it when her schedule permitted. That was yesterday afternoon. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not "I'll be right there" or "Is she okay," or "What hospital?" Just that she'd try to make it when her schedule permitted. As if visiting her sister in the ICU after life-threatening surgery was a scheduling inconvenience rather than an emergency priority. But even then, even as the reality of their absence began to sink in, I made excuses for them in my mind. They were busy professionals with important responsibilities. They probably assumed I was being overdramatic about my condition, just like I'd been overdramatic about everything else throughout my life. They'd come when they realized how serious the situation actually was. Hours passed. I watched other patients receive visitors throughout the day, worried spouses, concerned children, anxious friends who brought flowers and sat bedside holding hands and offering comfort. The contrast between their experiences and mine was stark and increasingly painful. Marcus arrived that evening, breathless and worried, carrying flowers and looking like he'd driven straight from work without stopping to change clothes. "I came as soon as I got your message," he said, rushing to my bedside. "I was in meetings all day and didn't check my phone until an hour ago. How are you feeling? What did the doctor say? Do you need anything?" His genuine concern and immediate response highlighted the absence of my family in a way that was both comforting and devastating. Here was someone who wasn't even legally related to me, who had dropped everything to be by my side, while my parents and sister couldn't be bothered to return a phone call about my life-threatening medical emergency. "Have you heard from your family?" Marcus asked, looking around the room as if expecting to see them. I shook my head, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to explain their absence. Marcus's expression darkened. "What do you mean you haven't heard from them?" "The hospital called them yesterday, right?" "Multiple times," I whispered. "Beverly says they've left detailed messages about the surgery and everything." I watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and anger as he processed what I was telling him. He pulled out his phone immediately. "I'm calling them myself," he said firmly. "There has to be some explanation for this." But I stopped him, grabbing his arm with what little strength I had. "Don't," I said. "Please don't call them." Because somewhere in the deepest part of my heart, I was beginning to understand a truth I'd been avoiding my entire life. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a communication error. This was exactly who my family was, and exactly how much I mattered to them. Calling them would only force them to articulate what their absence had already made clear. The next morning, while I was still trying to process my family's absence and make sense of their priorities, Sarah arrived at the hospital with my laptop and some work materials I'd requested. She'd become my unofficial work liaison, handling urgent matters while I recovered. "The whole office is worried about you," she said, settling into the visitor's chair that Marcus had occupied the night before. "Janet says to take all the time you need to recover and not to even think about work until you're completely better." It was touching to see how much my colleagues cared about my well-being, especially in contrast to my family's indifference. Sarah had brought get-well cards from the entire marketing team, had coordinated with HR to ensure my medical leave was properly documented, and had even organized a meal delivery service to my apartment for when I was released. "I brought your laptop in case you wanted to check emails or just have something to do while you're stuck in here," she said. "But seriously, don't feel pressured to work. Everyone understands you need to focus on getting better." After Sarah left, I opened the laptop mostly out of boredom and a desire to feel connected to the world outside the hospital room. I checked my work emails briefly, more out of habit than necessity, then found myself scrolling through social media to pass the time. That's when I discovered what my family had been doing while I was fighting for my life in the ICU. Jessica's Instagram account, which I followed despite our distant relationship, showed a carefully curated weekend at a luxury spa resort about 2 hours outside the city. The posts had started on Friday, the day before my collapse, and continued through the weekend I'd been hospitalized. Friday's post showed her feet in a pedicure chair with the caption, "Finally getting some much-needed self-care. This residency has been brutal, but Dr. Jess deserves a little pampering. Nail polish sparkles #self-care #spada #well-deserved." Saturday's posts documented various spa treatments, massages, facials, yoga classes, each tagged with location markers and accompanied by captions about deserving this break and finally prioritizing her mental health. There were photos of expensive meals, luxury accommodations, and spa amenities, all shared with her 3,000 followers who commented with praise for her dedication to self-care. Sunday's posts were even more jarring to see from my hospital bed. Pictures of her lounging by the pool, getting another massage, enjoying champagne and strawberries in her suite. The captions talked about how refreshed and renewed she felt, how important it was to disconnect from stress and responsibility, and how she was already planning her next spa getaway. But the post that made my blood run cold was uploaded Sunday evening, right around the time the hospital social worker had called her about my condition. It was a selfie of Jessica in a plush spa robe, face glowing from treatments, with the caption, "Last few hours of paradise before returning to reality." Sometimes you just have to put yourself first and ignore all the drama trying to pull you down. Victory hand woman in lotus position #boundaries are healthy #self first #no negativity. She had been there. She had been reachable. She had been posting on social media while I was having emergency surgery. The hospital social worker had called her during her spa weekend, explained that her sister was in critical condition following life-threatening surgery, and Jessica had decided that her luxury vacation was more important than my medical emergency. The drama trying to pull you down comment felt particularly cruel, as if my near-death experience was an inconvenience designed to ruin her relaxation time. The boundaries are healthy suggested that she viewed ignoring her hospitalized sister as a form of self-care rather than heartless abandonment. I scrolled further back in her feed and found posts from earlier in the week that provided even more context. She'd been planning and looking forward to this spa weekend for weeks, had saved money specifically for the luxury treatments, and had been posting countdown posts about her much-deserved break from everyone else's problems. My collapse, my surgery, my life-threatening condition, these weren't emergencies that required her attention. They were problems and drama that she had every right to ignore in favor of her own comfort and pleasure. But Jessica's posts weren't the end of the social media betrayal. I found similar content on my mother's Facebook page, though her version of the weekend was more subtle and socially acceptable. Mom had posted photos from what appeared to be a wine-tasting event with her law firm colleagues, also taking place over the weekend I was hospitalized. Her post showed her smiling and laughing with coworkers, enjoying expensive wines and gourmet food at what looked like a corporate retreat or team-building event. The captions were more restrained than Jessica's but equally telling: "Great weekend connecting with colleagues and recharging for the week ahead, and sometimes the best therapy is good wine and better company." Wineglass. Like Jessica, she had been reachable, available, and posting on social media while her daughter was in the ICU. The hospital had called her multiple times, left detailed voicemails about my condition and the surgery I needed, and she had chosen to prioritize her professional social obligations over her child's medical emergency. Dad's social media presence was more limited, but his LinkedIn profile showed he'd been active during the weekend, endorsing colleagues and commenting on professional posts. He hadn't been unreachable due to his own medical emergencies or surgical obligations. He'd been networking and maintaining his professional relationships while ignoring calls about his daughter's hospitalization. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. My family hadn't failed to come to the hospital because of miscommunication, scheduling conflicts, or their own emergencies. They had made conscious, deliberate choices to prioritize their own comfort, pleasure, and professional obligations over my life-threatening medical crisis. They had received the calls, understood the severity of my condition, and decided that I wasn't worth interrupting their weekend plans. Jessica's spa treatments were more important than my surgery. Mom's wine tasting was more important than my recovery. Dad's LinkedIn activity was more important than his daughter's brush with death. The social media evidence also revealed something else that was deeply painful. They weren't just ignoring me privately. They were publicly demonstrating their indifference, showing their social networks exactly where I ranked in their priorities. Their posts during my hospitalization were visible declarations that they had better things to do than care for their sick daughter and sister. As I sat in that hospital bed, surrounded by flowers from colleagues and cards from friends, scrolling through images of my family enjoying their weekend while I fought for my life, I felt something shift inside me. The desperate hope I'd carried for 26 years, that somehow, someday, they would see me as worthy of their love and attention, finally died. But in its place, something else was born. A cold, clear understanding of exactly who these people were, and a determination to ensure that their indifference would have consequences they never saw coming. The anger that built inside me during those hospital days wasn't the hot, explosive rage that burns out quickly. It was something cold and calculated, sharpened by years of psychological training in my family's games of manipulation and control. They had taught me well, perhaps too well, about the power of appearances, social expectations, and carefully crafted narratives. I spent my remaining days in the hospital not just recovering physically, but planning strategically. I had advantages my family didn't know about: a successful career that had taught me about marketing and public relations, a network of colleagues and friends who genuinely cared about me, and most importantly, complete documentation of their abandonment through hospital records, phone logs, and their own social media posts. Marcus visited every day, bringing meals, staying late into the evening, and handling practical matters like coordinating with my landlord and managing my bills. His consistent presence highlighted my family's absence in ways that were obvious to every nurse, doctor, and visitor who entered my room. "This is your boyfriend?" Beverly, my favorite nurse, asked one evening as Marcus helped me with dinner. "He's been here more than most family members I see." "He's amazing," I replied, loud enough for other patients' families in nearby rooms to hear. "I'm so lucky to have people who actually care about me." The comment was intentionally pointed, and I could see other visitors absorbing the implication that some people in my life cared while others clearly didn't. Sarah coordinated a steady stream of work colleagues who brought flowers, balloons, and genuine concern for my recovery. Janet, my supervisor, visited personally to assure me that my job was secure and that the company's health insurance would cover all my medical expenses. Even clients I'd worked with sent get-well cards and messages. The contrast was stark in public. My chosen family of friends and colleagues demonstrated consistent care and support, while my biological family remained conspicuously absent. Hospital staff began commenting on the situation, expressing surprise that such a young patient had so many caring friends but no family visitors. "It's unusual," Dr. Patterson mentioned during one of his rounds. "Most patients your age have parents and siblings calling constantly, wanting updates on their condition. Your emergency contacts never even returned our calls to get information about your surgery." I let the implication hang in the air, knowing that word would spread through the hospital staff about the family that couldn't be bothered to check on their daughter's life-threatening condition. But the real plan was bigger than hospital gossip. I was going to use every skill I'd learned in marketing and communications to ensure that my family's abandonment had consequences in the social and professional circles that mattered most to them. The first phase involved documentation. I requested copies of all hospital records showing the multiple attempts to contact my emergency contacts, the detailed voicemails that had been left explaining my condition, and the timeline of my treatment. I screenshot every social media post my family had made during my hospitalization, creating a comprehensive record of what they had prioritized over my medical emergency. I also gathered testimonials from hospital staff who had witnessed their abandonment. Beverly wrote a statement about how unusual it was for a patient's family to be completely unresponsive during a life-threatening emergency. Dr. Patterson provided documentation showing that my condition had been serious enough to warrant immediate family notification and that standard protocol had been followed in attempting to reach my emergency contacts. The second phase involved my professional network. My colleagues had been appalled by my family's behavior, and several offered to help in whatever way they could. Janet, who had connections throughout the local medical community due to our agency's healthcare clients, was particularly outraged. "Your father is a cardiac surgeon at Metropolitan General," she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "He's supposed to understand medical emergencies better than anyone. How could he ignore calls about his own daughter's condition?" Through Janet's connections, word about my family's abandonment began spreading through the medical community where my father worked. Medical professionals are a tight-knit community, and the story of a cardiac surgeon who ignored multiple calls about his daughter's life-threatening emergency was the kind of gossip that spread quickly through hospital break rooms and medical conferences. I also reached out to Marcus's mother, the retired nurse who had recognized my symptoms weeks before my collapse. She was horrified by my family's behavior and offered to share her professional perspective on how serious my condition had been and how inexcusable their response was. "Any medical professional knows that when a hospital calls multiple times about a family member's emergency surgery, you respond immediately," she told me. "The fact that your father is a doctor himself makes their behavior even more unconscionable." The third phase was the most calculated. I was going to expose their hypocrisy using their own social standards and expectations. My parents' social circle valued appearance, professional reputation, and family values above almost everything else. They attended charity galas, participated in community organizations, and built their public image around being successful, caring professionals and devoted family members. I crafted a carefully worded social media post that would go live simultaneously across multiple platforms, tagged to reach their professional and social networks. The post would include the hospital documentation, screenshots of their social media activity during my hospitalization, and a factual account of their abandonment presented in my most professional, non-emotional marketing voice. But first, I wanted to give them one final opportunity to do the right thing voluntarily. I was going to call them myself and see if they would acknowledge their behavior, show remorse, or make any effort to repair the damage they had caused. 3 days before my scheduled hospital discharge, I used the bedside phone to call my parents' house. Mom answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful as if nothing unusual had happened. "Maya. How nice to hear from you. How are things going?" The casual tone, as if we were having a routine catch-up call rather than the first contact after my life-threatening emergency, was immediately telling. "I'm calling from the hospital, Mom," I said quietly. "I had emergency surgery 3 days ago for internal bleeding that could have killed me." There was a pause, then, "Oh my. Well, I hope you're feeling better now." No shock, no panic, no questions about my condition or treatment. Just a polite expression of mild concern, as if I'd mentioned having a cold. "The hospital called you multiple times," I continued. "They left detailed messages about my condition and the surgery I needed. You never came. You never even called back to check on me." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her calculating her response. "Well, you know how busy things have been. Your father had several important surgeries scheduled, and I had that law firm retreat I couldn't miss. We assumed you were in good hands with the medical staff." The explanation was delivered matter-of-factly, without a hint of guilt or recognition that they might have made the wrong choice. "Mom, I almost died. The doctors said if I'd waited much longer to get treatment, my organs could have started failing. This wasn't a minor procedure, it was life-threatening emergency surgery." "But you're fine now, right?" she responded. "The important thing is that you're recovering. There's no point in dwelling on what's already over." I asked to speak with Dad, hoping he might have a different perspective given his medical background. "Maya," he said when he came to the phone, "your mother told me about your surgery. I'm glad you're recovering well." "Dad, why didn't you come to the hospital? Or at least call to check on my condition?" His response was clinical and detached. "You were receiving appropriate medical care. There wasn't anything I could have done that the attending physicians weren't already handling." Sometimes the most helpful thing family can do is stay out of the way and let professionals do their jobs. I realized he was treating my emergency surgery like a professional consultation rather than his daughter's brush with death. What about emotional support? I was scared and alone in the ICU. I needed my family there. "Maya, you're 26 years old. You need to learn to handle medical situations independently. Calling family members for emotional support during routine medical procedures isn't mature or appropriate." Routine medical procedures. He was classifying my life-threatening emergency surgery as routine, as if having a bleeding ulcer that required immediate transfusions and surgical repair was something any adult should handle alone. The conversation with Jessica was even more revealing. When I reached her at her apartment the next day, her first response was irritation. "Maya, I'm studying for boards. Can this wait?" "I was in the hospital having emergency surgery," I said. "The social worker called you 3 days ago." "Oh, right. Yeah, I got that message." How did everything go? No apology, no explanation for why she hadn't come or called, no acknowledgement that ignoring the hospital's call might have been inappropriate. How did everything go? I repeated. "Jessica, I could have died." I needed emergency surgery for internal bleeding, and you were posting spa selfies while I was in the ICU. Look, Maya, I had that spa weekend planned for months. I spent my own money on it, and I needed the break. You were getting medical care, so it's not like there was anything I could have done by rushing to the hospital. You could have been there for emotional support. You could have called to check on me. You could have shown that you cared whether I lived or died. Her response was the final confirmation I needed. Maya, you've always been overly dramatic about everything. I'm sure your condition wasn't as serious as you're making it sound. And frankly, I don't appreciate you trying to guilt-trip me for taking care of my own mental health. Overly dramatic. About nearly dying from internal bleeding and requiring emergency surgery. According to Jessica, my life-threatening medical emergency was just another example of my tendency to exaggerate problems for attention. After those phone calls, I knew exactly what I needed to do. They felt no remorse, showed no recognition of their failures, and demonstrated no intention of changing their behavior. They viewed their abandonment as reasonable and justified, and my pain as an overreaction to a minor inconvenience. The final phase of my plan went into effect the day I was discharged from the hospital. I published a detailed, factual account across Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter, making sure to tag professional organizations, mutual connections, and community groups my family was involved with. The post included hospital documentation showing the timeline of attempted contacts, screenshots of their social media activity during my hospitalization, and a professional, measured account of how my family had prioritized spa treatments, wine tastings, and professional networking over their daughter's life-threatening emergency. I didn't name-call, didn't use emotional language, didn't make any statements I couldn't support with documentation. I simply presented the facts and let people draw their own conclusions about a family that couldn't be bothered to visit or even call their daughter during emergency surgery. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The social media post went viral within hours, shared thousands of times by people who were outraged by my family's behavior. The combination of hospital documentation, their own social media posts, and the factual presentation of events created an undeniable narrative that spread rapidly through their professional and social circles. Medical professionals were particularly horrified by my father's behavior. Comments from doctors, nurses, and healthcare administrators expressed shock that a cardiac surgeon could ignore multiple calls about his daughter's life-threatening condition. Several medical professionals who knew my father personally commented publicly, expressing their disappointment and questioning his judgment. Dr. Chen has always presented himself as a family man who prioritizes his loved ones, wrote one colleague from his hospital. This situation raises serious questions about his character and values. The story gained traction in local news outlets when a healthcare reporter picked up on the viral post. The angle of a prominent surgeon abandoning his daughter during a medical emergency was too compelling to ignore, especially when supported by such thorough documentation. My mother's law firm became aware of the situation when partners and clients began asking questions about her judgment and priorities. The legal profession, like the medical field, values reputation and ethical behavior highly. Having a partner who ignored her daughter's emergency surgery to attend wine tastings reflected poorly on the firm's image. Jessica's residency program received multiple complaints from people who had seen the viral post. Medical residents are held to high standards of professional behavior and compassion, and her spa weekend during her sister's emergency surgery raised concerns about her suitability for patient care. But the consequences went far beyond professional embarrassment. Their social circle, built around appearances and status, began distancing themselves from the family. Charity organizations quietly removed them from invitation lists, country club members started avoiding them at social events, and longtime friends began questioning their character. The most satisfying moment came 2 weeks after my discharge, when my parents called me in a panic. "Maya, you need to take down that post immediately," Mom demanded. "It's causing serious problems for our careers and reputation. People are taking it completely out of context." "What context makes abandoning your daughter during emergency surgery acceptable?" I asked calmly. "You know we would have come if it had been really serious," Dad interjected. But hospitals call about everything these days. We assumed it was routine. Did you listen to the voicemails? I asked. They specifically said I was having emergency surgery for life-threatening internal bleeding. How is that routine? Silence. The point is, Mom continued, family business should stay private. This public humiliation isn't solving anything. You're right, I agreed. It's not solving anything. But it is ensuring that everyone knows exactly who you are and what your priorities are. Jessica called separately, crying for the first time I could remember since childhood. Maya, you're destroying my medical career before it even starts, she sobbed. The residency program is questioning whether I have the compassion necessary to be a doctor. You have to explain to people that this was all a misunderstanding. What was the misunderstanding? I asked. I thought. I mean, I assumed you were exaggerating how serious it was. You've always been dramatic about health issues. Jessica, when have I ever been dramatic about health issues? When have I ever called you asking for help with medical problems? She couldn't answer because the truth was that I'd never asked my family for help with anything, medical or otherwise. I'd learned early that they weren't reliable sources of support. Please, Maya, she begged. I'll do anything to make this right. I'll pay for your medical bills, I'll come visit you, whatever you want. Just please help me fix this. But it was too late for gestures and promises. The damage to their reputations was already done, and more importantly, they still didn't understand that their problem wasn't bad publicity, it was bad character. The most unexpected consequence came when my father was asked to step down from his position on the hospital's ethics committee. The irony was perfect. A man who had ignored his daughter's medical emergency was no longer considered suitable to make ethical decisions about patient care. My mother's law firm restructured her position, moving her to a less visible role with fewer client interactions. The managing partner explained that her judgment had come into question following the public revelation of her priorities during a family crisis. Jessica's residency program required her to undergo additional training in patient empathy and family communication, publicly acknowledging that her behavior during her sister's emergency had raised concerns about her suitability for medical practice. But the real victory wasn't their professional consequences, it was the relationships I built with people who reached out after seeing my story. Hundreds of people shared their own experiences with family abandonment, conditional love, and the journey to building chosen families of people who truly cared. Marcus proposed 3 months after my hospital stay, saying that watching how my family treated me during my crisis made him realize he wanted to spend his life ensuring I never felt abandoned again. His family welcomed me completely, offering the unconditional love and support I'd never experienced. My work family rallied around me in ways that were deeply healing. Janet promoted me to the senior position we'd discussed, saying that my grace under pressure and professional handling of personal crisis demonstrated exactly the leadership qualities they valued. The inheritance from a great-aunt I barely knew came 6 months later. Apparently she'd been following the family drama and decided to leave her estate to the granddaughter who had shown real character. The money allowed me to start a non-profit organization supporting young adults recovering from family trauma and medical crises. Most satisfying of all was the letter I received from my grandmother, my father's mother, who had seen the viral post through a mutual connection. Maya, she wrote, I had no idea how badly your parents had failed you. Your grandfather and I always wondered why you seemed so distant from the family, but we assumed it was normal teenage independence. Now I understand that you were protecting yourself from people who didn't deserve your love and trust. She continued, I'm ashamed that I didn't recognize the favoritism and emotional neglect you experienced. I'm changing my will to ensure that you inherit the family home and properties, rather than your parents. They've proven they don't understand the value of family loyalty. Looking back on this experience, I realize that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come from the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally. But they also teach us something valuable about our own strength and resilience. My family's abandonment during my medical crisis was the final proof I needed that their love was conditional and limited. Have you ever had a moment where family showed their true colors during a crisis? How did you handle discovering that people you thought would be there for you simply weren't? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us all feel less alone. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I share more stories about overcoming family trauma, building chosen families, and finding your own worth when the people who should value you don't. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve better than conditional love. Thank you for watching, for your support, and for all the messages you send about your own journeys. Remember that your worth isn't determined by how your family treats you, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop trying to earn love from people who've shown you they're incapable of giving it freely. Take care of yourselves, trust your instincts, and remember that you deserve people in your life who show up for you when it matters most. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep building the life and relationships you truly deserve.